Ready? Jesus Christ defined the last 2 millennia time. My name is Travis, and I'm a believer in the death and resurrection of Jesus. This has not always been the case. For me, it took a great deal of evidence and convincing. Today, I'd like to share with you that evidence. What made Jesus so important was not anything that he did in life, but what he did with his death and resurrection. His resurrection changed the world for forever. When considering this topic, we must ask ourselves 3 questions. First, could Jesus have survived his time on the cross? Second, was his tomb empty? And third, did people see the resurrected Christ 3 days later? To answer the first, we will consider the interview of Dr. Alexander Metherell, MD and PhD, and renowned expert in the resurrection. Jesus, before going to the cross, was whipped by the Roman soldiers. A standard Roman whipping was 39 lashes, with a whip that consisted of braided leather with metal balls and bone fragments sewn in. It would have caused deep gouges and much bleeding. These lashings alone were often deadly. Frequently, those who suffered them did not even make it to the crucifixion. From the whipping and the blood loss and Jesus' repeated requests for water, and when the Roman centurion stabbed Jesus through the chest, and was described as having blood and water flow from his chest cavity, Dr. Metherell ascertained that Jesus was suffering from hypovolemic shock. WebMD characterized hypovolemic shock as a deadly condition, even with modern medicine and quick aid. Many patients still die. By the time he was on the cross, Jesus' death was all but a foregone conclusion. Still on the cross, he suffered further torment by having stakes driven through each of his wrists and his feet, and his constant struggle to breathe. Now that we know that his death was almost a certainty on that cross, we must ask ourselves, was the tomb empty 3 days later? For this, we need the words of Dr. William Craig, PhD and Doctorate of Theology. The strongest evidence here is from the men that killed Jesus themselves, the Pharisees. Their goal was to squash this upstart religion of the Christians. But when faced with the idea of the empty tomb, they never argued with it. They merely agreed and said that it was the apostles that stole Jesus' body from under the nose of 2 Roman soldiers who were guarding it, who knew it would be their own death for failure at their duty. These followers moved a stone, which would require 10 people, from in front of the tomb and spirited the body away. But never was there any contradiction to the fact that the tomb was empty. If both followers and adversaries alike agree that the tomb was empty, the next question we must ask is, did Jesus appear alive before people in the days following his resurrection? Dr. Habermas, PhD, relies on 1 Corinthians 15:5-8 to make this case. He appeared to Peter, and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, and then to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me also. So what makes this passage different from all the others in the Bible affirming the resurrection of Christ? First of all, according to Habermas and most other historians, this area represents a creed of the early Christians, something that would have been recited, much like the Lord's Prayer is today. It dates back to within as little as 2 years from the resurrection itself. This is far too early for any kind of legendary material to have sprung up. So the words that were written there were the words that were spoken at the time. Lastly, this is Paul, daring people to contradict him, saying there are 50-some people alive and well, ready to tell you that the same thing I am telling you, that Jesus was resurrected. He invited anybody who had questions, who had doubts, to go and talk to these people and see if they could believe their claims, that they were willing to die. What you've heard today but scratches the surface of what these 3 doctors can tell us about the resurrection. Still, it is compelling evidence that Christ died on the cross, that his tomb was empty, and that many witnesses saw him alive again 3 days later. I leave you with this final thought, and perhaps the greatest piece of evidence for the resurrection. The people who were there that day, who saw him rise, were willing to die so that they could have the truth of the resurrection known. So ask yourself this: would you have been willing to die for something that was false? I know I wouldn't have been.